As she opened the refrigerator, she heard heavy footsteps behind her. What are you doing? Dotun's voice boomed from the doorway, startling her. Onome quickly turned around, holding a bottle of water in her hand. I I was just getting some water, she stammered. Dotun's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward and snatched the bottle from her hand. This water is expensive, he snapped. I don't share it with anyone. You can have the tap water. Once upon a time, in the beautiful town of Ayetoro, there lived a man named Dotun. Ayetoro was a place full of life, with vibrant markets, friendly people, and children playing in the streets. The town had a warm feeling, with its tall palm trees swaying in the gentle breeze, and houses painted in bright colors. Life in Ayetoro seemed peaceful and full of joy, but Dotun wasn't like most people in the town. He was different. He wasn't interested in socializing or making friends. In fact, Dotun preferred to keep to himself, and that's exactly how he lived. Dotun was a tall man with broad shoulders and a handsome face. People in the town often talked about how good looking he was, but despite his looks, Dotun was known for being quiet and reserved. He didn't have many friends, and he hardly ever smiled. He was always busy with his work, running his own business. Dotun had a reputation for being hardworking and serious. He wasn't the kind of man you would find chatting at the local bar or hanging out with people at the park. He just didn't like to associate with anyone, especially women. Despite his quiet and serious nature, there was one thing that Dotun absolutely loved: children. Whenever he saw children playing in the street or running around the market, he couldn't help but smile. There was something about their laughter and joy that made him feel happy inside, even if he didn't show it to anyone. But as much as Dotun loved children, there was one thing he had promised himself: he would never ever get married. Dotun's decision to stay away from women wasn't just because he was shy or uninterested. It went much deeper than that. Dotun had grown up with only his father, a man who had raised him all by himself. His father, Mr. Ajayi, was a kind man, but he had been hurt deeply by Dotun's mother. Mr. Ajayi had loved Dotun's mother with all his heart. They had gotten married, and soon after, Dotun was born. Life was perfect, or so it seemed. But one day, everything changed. Dotun's father discovered that his beloved wife had been unfaithful to him. She had been seeing Mr. Ajayi's best friend behind his back. And when Mr. Ajayi found out, his heart was shattered. He couldn't believe that the woman he loved so much had betrayed him in such a painful way. His anger and sadness, Mr. Ajayi chased Dotun's mother out of the house. She left without looking back, leaving Dotun behind with his father. From that day on, Mr. Ajayi decided to raise Dotun alone. He never spoke about Dotun's mother again, and he never remarried. Watching his father struggle to take care of him made Dotun feel a deep anger towards women. He believed that all women were like his mother, unfaithful and unreliable. Dotun grew up with this belief, and it shaped the way he saw the world. As Dotun grew older, he became more and more determined to avoid women at all costs. Even though many of the young women in Ayetoro admired him and tried to get his attention, Dotun never showed any interest. He had no time for love, no time for relationships, and certainly no time for marriage. To him, it was all a waste of time, and he didn't want to end up like his father, heartbroken and alone. Dotun only had a few close friends, and even they didn't know much about his personal life. But there was one friend who knew Dotun better than anyone else, his best friend Tayo. Tayo was Dotun's complete opposite. He was cheerful, outgoing, and loved to socialize. He was always surrounded by people, and he especially enjoyed spending time with women. Tayo believed that life was meant to be enjoyed, and he couldn't understand why Dotun was so serious all the time. Dotun, my man, you need to loosen up a bit though, Tayo would say whenever they met. Life is too short to be so serious. Come on, let's go out, meet some people, have some fun. But Dotun would always shake his head and refuse. I'm not interested, Tayo. You know I don't like hanging out with crowds. And I definitely don't want to meet any woman. Tayo would laugh and tease him. Are you sure there is nothing you are hiding from me, Dotun? Maybe you secretly like someone and you are just too shy to admit it. Dotun would roll his eyes. You know that's not true, Tayo. I have told you before. I don't want to get involved with any woman. They are all the same. Trouble. No, not all of them are the same, Tayo would argue. You can't let what happened with your parent stop you from living your life. There are good women out there, trust me. But Dotun would never listen. His mind was made up, and nothing, Tayo said, could change it. He had seen what his father went through, and he wasn't about to let the same thing happen to him. So, no matter how much Tayo tried to convince him, Dotun remained firm in his decision to stay away from women. Even when they were in school, Dotun had never had a girlfriend. While other boys were busy dating and going to parties, Dotun focused on his studies. He worked hard, determined to make something of himself, and he succeeded. After graduating, he got a good job and eventually he started his own business. But even then, with all his success, there was still no woman in his life. Tayo would often tease him about it, but Dotun didn't mind. To him, being single was a choice, his choice. Dotun, you are going to grow old and lonely if you don't find someone, Tayo would say with a grin. Don't you want to have a family one day? Don't you want kids running around your house? Dotun's expression would soften at the mention of children. I love children, Tayo, you know that. But I don't need a wife to have children. Tayo would raise an eyebrow. Really? And how exactly do you plan to have children without a wife? Dotun shrugged. There are other ways, Tayo. I could adopt or I don't know. But one thing I'm sure of is that I won't get married. Tayo sighed. You are a hard man to convince, Dotun. But I won't give up. One day, you will change your mind. And when you do, I'll be right here to say I told you so. Dotun would smile a little at Tayo's words, but deep down, he knew he wouldn't change his mind. The idea of marriage, of trusting a woman, was something he just couldn't accept. He had seen the pain it cost his father, and he wasn't willing to take that risk. Besides, Dotun was happy with his life the way it was. He had his business, his few close friends, and the children in the neighborhood who always greeted him with smiles whenever he walked by. That was enough for him. And so, Dotun continued to live his life in Ayetoro, keeping to himself and avoiding the world of romance and relationships. His heart had been hardened by the past, and no amount of persuasion from Tayo or anyone else could change that. For Dotun, the path he had chosen was clear, and he was determined to walk it alone. But little did he know that life had a way of surprising people. Sometimes, the things we try hardest to avoid are the very things that find us in the end. Time passed, and Dotun remained as steadfast in his belief as ever. Tayo, his best friend, hadn't given up on trying to change Dotun's mind though. Every now and then, Tayo would set Dotun up with women, hoping that maybe one of them would break through Dotun's stubbornness. But each time, Dotun would walk out on the date without saying much, leaving the women confused and hurt. One evening, after yet another failed attempt, Dotun confronted Tayo. I told you to stop doing this, Tayo, Dotun said, frustration clear in his voice. They were sitting in Dotun's small living room, with the evening sun casting long shadows on the floor. I don't want you setting me up with anyone. I don't need it, and I don't want it. Tayo, leaning back in his chair, sighed. I'm just trying to help you, Dotun. You can't keep living like this forever, avoiding people, avoiding women. It's not healthy. I'm fine the way I am, Dotun replied sharply. I don't need your help, and I certainly don't need a woman in my life. I told you, Tayo, all women are the same. They can't be trusted. Tayo shook his head. Not all women are like your mother, Dotun. You can't judge everyone based on what she did. I'm not judging anyone. I'm protecting myself. Dotun shot back. He stood up and began pacing the room. You think I want to end up like my father? Heartbroken, abandoned? No, Tayo. I'm never going to let that happen. This conversation had become a routine between the two of them, and Tayo had grown tired of it. Fine, Tayo said, throwing his hands up in defeat. If you don't want my help, I won't try anymore. But don't come crying to me later when you realize you are wrong. Dotun smiled. Don't worry, I won't. After that, Tayo kept his word. He stopped trying to set Dotun up with women and stopped pestering him about dating. But the tension between them lingered. Tayo, who was always cheerful and full of life, couldn't understand why Dotun was so determined to stay lonely. They began to drift apart, though they remained friends. The carefree conversations they used to have were replaced with awkward silences. Not long after, Tayo got married. His bride, Annabel, was a kind and gentle woman. She was everything Dotun thought women weren't: caring, understanding, and loyal. Of course, Dotun was Tayo's best man at the wedding. But even on that special day, Dotun couldn't help but discourage Tayo. Tayo, Dotun had said as they stood together before the ceremony. Tayo adjusting his tie nervously. You don't have to do this, you know. There is still time to walk away. Tayo looked at his friend, a mixture of amusement and annoyance on his face. Walk away? Dotun, I'm about to marry the love of my life. Why would I walk away? Dotun shrugged. Because all women are the same. You will regret this one day, just like my father did. Tayo shook his head. Dotun, for the last time, not all women are like your mother. Annabel is different. You will see. Dotun didn't respond. He didn't believe it. In his mind, no matter how kind Annabel seemed, she would eventually show her true colors, just like his mother had. After the wedding, Dotun began visiting Tayo and Annabel's home regularly. At first, it seemed innocent enough. He would stop by for a chat or to hang out with Tayo. But over time, Dotun's visits became more frequent, and his behavior changed. He began eavesdropping on Annabel's conversations, watching her closely as if waiting for her to make a mistake. She's hiding something, Dotun would say to Tayo after one of his visits. I can feel it. Tayo, tired of Dotun's constant accusations, would sigh. Dotun, stop it. Annabel isn't hiding anything. She's a good woman. But Dotun wouldn't let go. You will see, Tayo. One day, she will show you who she really is. Things reached a boiling point when one evening, Annabel, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Dotun's presence, finally confronted Tayo. Tayo, she said, her voice soft but firm. Why is your friend always here? And why does he act like he's watching me, waiting for me to mess up? It's like he's trying to find fault in everything I do. Tayo, who loved his wife, felt torn. He knew Annabel was right. Dotun had been acting strange, almost paranoid. But Dotun was his best friend, and Tayo didn't want to hurt him. I'm sorry, Annabel, Tayo said, taking her hand. I will talk to him. I will make sure he doesn't come around as much. Annabel nodded. Thank you, Tayo. I don't want there to be any tension between us because of him. The next day, Tayo confronted Dotun. They met at a small bar in town, away from prying eyes. Dotun, Tayo began, his tone serious. I need to talk to you. What's up? Dotun asked, sipping his drink. You have been coming around too much, Tayo said bluntly, and Annabel doesn't like the way you have been acting. Dotun raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean, Tayo continued, you have been trying to find fault in everything she does. You are always watching her, listening to her conversations. It's making her uncomfortable. Dotun frowned. I'm just trying to help you, Tayo. I'm looking out for you. I don't need you to look out for me, Tayo snapped, his patience wearing thin. Annabel is my wife and I trust her. I don't need you coming around trying to find problems where there aren't any. Dotun's expression hardened. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you when things go wrong. When Kasala burst, don't call me. Tayo sighed, frustrated. Dotun, I don't want to hear it. Just stay away from my house for a while, okay? We can hang out at the bar or at your place, but not at mine. Annabel doesn't deserve this. Reluctantly, Dotun agreed. After that, their meetings were limited to the bar or Dotun's home, and things between Tayo and Annabel seemed to settle down. But Dotun remained convinced that Tayo was making a mistake and that one day he would be proven right. Despite his strained relationship with Tayo, Dotun still had someone in his life who cared deeply for him, his aunt, Auntie Stella. Auntie Stella was his father's sister, and she had practically raised Dotun alongside his father after his mother left. She was like a second mother to him, always checking in on him, making sure he was eating well and taking care of himself. Auntie Stella would visit Dotun often, and every time she did, she would bring up the topic, his love life, or rather, his lack of one. Dotun, she would say, sitting down on the sofa with a sigh. When are you going to settle down? You're not getting any younger, you know. Dotun would laugh, trying to divert the conversation. Auntie, I'm fine. I don't need a wife. I have my business and I'm happy. But Auntie Stella wasn't easily swayed. Happy? How can you be happy all alone? You need someone to share your life with, someone to take care of you. I don't need anyone to take care of me, Auntie. Dotun will reply, still smiling. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Auntie Stella will shake her head, her eyes filled with concern. Dotun, listen to me. Not all women are like your mother. There are good women out there. Women who will love and care for you. You can't let what happened to your father ruin your chance at happiness. But no matter how many times Auntie Stella said it, Dotun wouldn't listen. He was 37 years old and he had made up his mind. Women were trouble and he wanted nothing to do with them. Dad suffered in the hands of my mom, Dotun would say sometimes, thinking aloud. I'm not going to let that happen to me. Auntie Stella would sigh, knowing that nothing she said would change Dotun's mind. She loved him and she wanted the best for him, even if he didn't realize it. She knew that deep down, Dotun was lonely and she hoped that one day he would open his heart and let someone in. One sunny afternoon, Auntie Stella arrived at Dotun's doorstep with a young woman by her side. The air in Ayotoro was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the street. Dotun had been inside, minding his own business as usual, when he heard the knock on the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he walked to the door with a slight frown. When he opened it and saw his beloved Auntie Stella standing there, his expression softened. Auntie Stella had always been like a second mother to him, and despite their constant disagreement about his love life, he adored her. Standing next to her was a young woman he didn't recognize. She was in her 20s, with smooth brown skin, bright eyes, and a warm smile. She looked polite and a little nervous. Ah, Auntie Stella, Dotun exclaimed, stepping forward to hug her. What a surprise! What brings you here today? Auntie Stella grinned, hugging him back tightly. Dotun, my dear, I just thought I would pay you a visit. I didn't come alone. She gestured to a young woman standing beside her. This is Onome. Dotun glanced at the girl and gave a small nod, unsure of what to make of her. Onome, okay, who is she? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Before Auntie Stella could answer, she nudged him playfully. Are you not going to invite us in first? Or do you plan on keeping us standing at the door? Dotun chuckled awkwardly, stepping aside to let them in. Of course, come in, he said, though there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. Something about this visit felt different, and Dotun had a sinking feeling that his aunt had more than a casual visit in mind. Inside the living room, Auntie Stella and Onome sat down on the sofa while Dotun remained standing, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He wasn't the most welcoming host, especially with strangers in his home. So, Dotun began, looking from his aunt to Onome. Who is she? Why is she here? Auntie Stella, always full of charm, smiled brightly. Dotun, I told you, this is Onome. She's the daughter of my best friend. She just graduated and got a job here in Ayetoro. Okay, Dotun said slowly, still unsure. And, and, Auntie Stella continued. She's going to stay here with you for a while. Dotun's eyes widened in surprise. What? He exclaimed, pushing himself off the wall. Stay here? Why? Because, Auntie Stella said patiently, she needs a place to stay until she finds an apartment. Your house is big enough for both of you, and it will only be for a little while. Dotun looked at Onome, who was sitting quietly, looking around the living room with curiosity. Then he turned back to his aunt. I don't understand. Why will she stay here? Can't she stay somewhere else? And why didn't you ask me first, Auntie? Auntie Stella raised her hands in a calming gesture. Dotun, relax. It's not a big deal. She's a nice girl, very responsible. You won't even notice she's here. Dotun wasn't convinced. Something about this situation didn't sit right with him. And he had a feeling his aunt had ulterior motives. He needed to talk to her alone. Auntie, he said quietly, can I speak to you in private? Auntie Stella gave him a knowing look but stood up without arguing. Of course, she said, following him into the kitchen, leaving Onome alone in the living room. Once they were in the kitchen, Dotun wasted no time. Auntie, why are you really doing this? He asked, his voice low but firm. Why are you bringing a woman into my house? You know how I feel about this. Auntie Stella smiled, trying to play innocent. Dotun, calm down. Onome is here for work, not for anything else. She just needs a place to stay until she finds her own. Dotun shook his head. No, Auntie. I know you too well. You are trying to set us up, aren't you? Auntie Stella looked at him with wide eyes. What? No, of course not. I wouldn't do that. Dotun crossed his arms. Auntie, I don't want this. I don't need a woman in my life, and I definitely don't want one living in my house. Auntie Stella sighed, her tone becoming more serious. Dotun, she's not here to cause any trouble. She will be gone as soon as she finds her own place, I promise. Just give her a chance. You will hardly see her. Dotun frowned. If this is about setting us up, then forget it. It's not going to happen. I'm not setting you up, Dotun. Just trust me on this one, Auntie Stella pleaded. Please. She has nowhere else to go right now. Dotun was silent for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't like this idea at all, but he also didn't want to seem heartless. After a long pause, he sighed. Fine, she can stay, but only for a short while. And she has to follow my rules. Auntie Stella smiled in relief. Thank you, Dotun. You won't regret it, I promise. Dotun wasn't so sure about that. Let's go back, he said, walking towards the living room with his aunt. Back in the living room, Onome was sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She smiled politely when she saw them return, but Dotun didn't smile back. Dotun cleared his throat, looking at her. Follow me, he said, his voice cold and detached. Onome stood up quietly and followed him down the hallway to one of the guest rooms. Dotun opened the door and pointed inside. This will be your room, he said flatly. You stay here and stay away from me and my things. Do you understand? Onome nodded, her voice soft. Yes, sir, I understand. Dotun gave her one last stern look before turning and walking away without another word. Onome stood in the doorway watching him leave, feeling a mixture of confusion and sadness. She hadn't expected Dotun to be so cold. After a few moments, Auntie Stella came to say goodbye. She gave Onome a reassuring hug and whispered, Don't mind him. He's just like that. Everything will be fine, I promise. Onome smiled weakly. I hope so, Auntie. As soon as Auntie Stella left, Onome decided to settle in. She unpacked her things and tried to make herself comfortable in the unfamiliar house. Later that evening, she felt thirsty and decided to get some water from the kitchen. As she opened the refrigerator, she heard heavy footsteps behind her. What are you doing? Dotun's voice boomed from the doorway, startling her. Onome quickly turned around, holding a bottle of water in her hand. I I was just getting some water, she stammered. Dotun's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward and snatched the bottle from her hand. This water is expensive, he snapped. I don't share it with anyone. You can have the tap water. Onome blinked in surprise, her heart racing. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Dotun glared at her, his tone harsh. Next time, ask before touching anything that belongs to me. Do you understand? Onome nodded quickly. Yes, sir, I understand. Without another word, Dotun turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Onome standing there, feeling even more uncomfortable than before. She returned to her room, sitting on the edge of the bed, deep in thought. Why is he so bitter? She wondered to herself. Dotun's anger and coldness confused her, and she couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Whatever had happened in his past had clearly hurt him deeply, and it had turned him into someone who pushed people away. That night, as Onome lay in bed, she prayed silently. God, please help me handle this situation. I don't want to cause any problems. Just help me stay out of his way. And with that, she closed her eyes, hoping that the days ahead wouldn't be as difficult as they seemed. Onome's stay in Dotun's house was far from easy. Every day felt like walking on eggshells. She tried her best to stay out of his way, leaving the house early in the morning for work and returning late in the evening, hoping to avoid his constant criticisms. Yet, no matter what she did, Dotun always seemed to find something to be angry about. Whether it was a towel not folded properly, a light left on by mistake, or even the sound of her footsteps as she moved around, Dotun was always there, ready to shout or scold her. Despite all this, Onome remained patient. She had a kind heart, and even though Dotun's attitude hurt her, she believed there was a reason for his bitterness. She knew that somewhere deep inside, Dotun wasn't as harsh as he appeared to be. But that didn't make living under the same roof any easier. One day, after a particular long day at work, Onome returned home feeling more exhausted than usual. As she walked through the door, she braced herself for whatever complaint Dotun might throw her way. But the house was unusually quiet. She glanced around, seeing that Dotun was in his room, the door slightly ajar. She could see him sitting at his desk, focused on his laptop. The silence gave her an idea, a chance to finally talk to him. Taking a deep breath, Onome walked to his door and knocked gently. Dotun looked up from his laptop, his face instantly hardening when he saw her standing there. What do you want? He snapped. Onome hesitated, then gathered her courage. I would like to talk to you for a few minutes, if that's okay. Dotun's eyes narrowed. If you want to talk, at least knock properly. Go back and come in again. Onome's heart sank, but she had no choice. She nodded quietly, turned around, and left the room, closing the door behind her. She took another deep breath before knocking again, this time waiting until Dotun said, Come in. When she stepped back into the room, Dotun remained seated, his eyes back on his laptop. You're wasting my time, he muttered. Just say whatever you want to say. Onome stood there, feeling small under the weight of his words, but she couldn't back down now. I just want to understand, she began softly, why you are so mean and hostile, especially towards women. I haven't done anything to upset you, but you always seem angry with me. Dotun's expression changed in an instant. He stood up from his chair, his anger flashing out like a storm. What did you just say? He barked, stepping towards her. Onome instinctively took a step back, her voice trembling. I just want to know why you treat women this way. Get out, Dotun growled, his eyes blazing with fury. Get out of my room and never ask me stupid questions like that again. Onome's heart raced, and she quickly turned to leave, feeling a mixture of fear and sadness. She hadn't meant to upset him, but his reaction was far more intense than she had expected. I'm sorry, she mumbled before closing the door behind her, leaving Dotun alone in his room, his fists clenched in anger. The next morning, the tension between them was even worse. Onome kept her distance, doing her best to avoid Dotun altogether. But later that day, something happened that neither of them expected. Dotun's father came to visit. When Dotun's father arrived, Onome was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She heard the knock on the door and out of habit went to answer it. When she opened the door, she was met by an older man with a warm smile and kind eyes. Good afternoon, sir. Onome greeted him politely. The older man's eyes lit up with surprise and delight. Good afternoon, my dear, he replied. You must be Onome. I've heard about you. Onome smiled, slightly confused. Yes, sir. How do you know my name? Before he could answer, Dotun appeared in the hallway, his face lighting up when he saw his father. Daddy, he exclaimed, walking over to embrace him. What a surprise! I wasn't expecting you. Dotun's father smiled, patting his son on the back. I decided to drop by. It's been too long. As they entered the living room, Dotun's father glanced back at Onome. Is she? Dotun quickly interrupted, shaking his head. God forbid, he said firmly. She's not my girlfriend. His father chuckled, raising an eyebrow. Then, who is she? Dotun sighed, sitting down beside his father. She's the daughter of Auntie Stella's friend. She's staying here temporarily until she finds a place of her own. His father nodded slowly, looking thoughtful. Ah, I see. Well, she seems like a nice girl. Dotun rolled his eyes. She might be, but that doesn't matter. I'm not interested. His father leaned back in his chair, studying Dotun closely. Son, maybe you should give her a chance. You are not getting any younger. And she might make a good wife. You don't know. At those words, Dotun's face darkened. A good wife? He scoffed. Just like mom was a good wife, right? His father's smile faded, and the room grew quiet. Dotun, he said gently, not every woman is like your mother. That's what you keep saying, Daddy. Dotun shot back, his voice rising in anger. But how can you be so sure? She betrayed you, Dad. She left you for your best friend, and you just let it happen. Why should I trust any woman after that? His father sighed, rubbing his hands together. Dotun, I know what your mother did hurt us both, but you can't spend the rest of your life hating all women because of her. Not every woman is like that, Dotun. I'm not hating anyone, Dad, Dotun muttered, though the bitterness in his voice said otherwise. I'm just being smart. I'm not going to let anyone do to me what mom did to you. His father leaned forward, placing a hand on Dotun's shoulder. Son, I understand your pain. Believe me, I do. But holding on to this anger will only hurt you in the end. You deserve to be happy. And maybe Onome could be the one to help you find that happiness. Dotun shook his head stubbornly. No, I don't need anyone. I'm fine on my own, Dad. His father's eyes softened with sadness. You are not fine, Dotun. I see it in you. Even if you don't want to admit it, you are lonely and you are pushing away the people who care about you. Please, think about what I'm saying. Dotun remained silent. His jaw clenched. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to think about the possibility that his father might be right. After a long pause, Dotun's father sighed and stood up. I won't push you any further, but just promise me you will think about it. Dotun nodded reluctantly. I will think about it. His father smiled faintly, though Dotun could see the worry in his eyes. I'll be going now, his father said. Take care of yourself, son, and give Onome a chance. She might surprise you. Dotun watched as his father left, the door closing softly behind him. He sat there for a long time, staring at the floor, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Unknown to Dotun, Onome had overheard the entire conversation from the kitchen. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words had been impossible to ignore. Now she understood. She finally had an answer to the questions that had been bothering her since the day she moved in. Why was Dotun so bitter? Dotun's pain ran deeper than she had imagined. His mother's betrayal had left a scar on his heart, a scar that hadn't healed even after all these years. Onome felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew that kind of hurt, though not in the same way. It wasn't just about anger or bitterness, it was about fear, fear of being hurt again. But Onome also believed that it was time for Dotun to let go of that pain. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and she wasn't sure if she could help him. But she hoped that one day, Dotun will realize that not everyone was out to hurt him. For now, she would keep her distance and continue praying that things would eventually change for Dotun's sake and maybe even for her own. Onome and Dotun continued living under the same roof, but their relationship was far from friendly. It was more like living with a stranger who only spoke when it was absolutely necessary. Every day felt like a quiet battle, with Onome doing everything she could to avoid crossing paths with Dotun. She would leave the house early in the morning for work and return late at night, trying to be invisible. Even when they did happen to bump into each other, there was hardly any exchange beyond a cold greeting or a brief nod. The tension in the house was thick, and neither of them seemed eager to change that. Whenever Tayo visited, the atmosphere lightened a little. Tayo had a way of bringing some humor into the house, and he never missed a chance to tease Dotun about Onome. Dotun, my man, Tayo would say with a grin. What if Onome is your destined wife? Have you ever thought about that? Dotun will shake his head in disbelief. Tayo, please. You know I don't believe in such nonsense. Destined wife? She's just a tenant here, nothing more. But Tayo would laugh and continue teasing him. You can keep denying it all you want. But who knows? Fate has a funny way of working. Dotun will roll his eyes. Fate has nothing to do with this, Tayo. She will be gone soon, and that will be the end of it. However, 2 months passed, and Onome was still living in Dotun's house. One evening, as she returned from work, Dotun finally decided it was time to confront her. He couldn't take the situation any longer. Her presence, though quiet, was beginning to feel like an inconvenience. He waited until she had settled in for the evening, then knocked on her door. Onome opened the door slowly, surprised to see Dotun standing there. He hadn't knocked on her door in weeks, and she wondered what he wanted. Yes? She asked cautiously. Dotun crossed his arms, his expression serious. When are you leaving? Onome blinked in confusion. Excuse me. You have been here for 2 months, Dotun said, his tone flat. You said you were staying temporarily, but it's been long enough. You are starting to inconvenience me. Onome's heart sank. She had been looking for a place, but things hadn't worked out as quickly as she had hoped. She had no intention of overstaying her welcome, but she also didn't have anywhere else to go yet. I'm really sorry, Dotun, she said softly, lowering her gaze. I know I have been here longer than I planned. I have been trying to find an apartment, but it's taking time. Please, just give me a little more time. I promise I will leave soon. Dotun sighed, clearly frustrated. But he didn't push the matter further. Fine, he said after a pause. But make it quick. I don't like sharing my space. Onome nodded quickly. Thank you. I really appreciate. With that, Dotun turned and walked away, leaving Onome standing there, feeling both relieved and uneasy. She knew her time in Dotun's house was coming to an end. but she still needed to figure out where to go next. Meanwhile, Dotun's aunt, Auntie Stella, and his father, Mr. Jai, continued their regular visits, each time bringing up the same topic: Dotun's refusal to settle down. Dotun, my dear, Auntie Stella would say, shaking her head in exasperation, you are not getting any younger. What are you waiting for? Onome is a good girl, and she's right here in your house. Why can't you give her a chance? Dotun would groan, clearly tired of the conversation. Auntie, we have been through this. I'm not interested in marriage, and I'm definitely not interested in Onome. She's just a guest, that's all. His father would nod in agreement with Auntie Stella. Dotun, listen to your aunt. Life is passing by, and you are missing out on the chance to have a family. Onome seems like a kind hearted girl. Maybe she's the one for you. Dotun will shake his head stubbornly. Dad, I'm not marrying anyone. I have told you both that over and over again. Why can't you just let it go? One day, Auntie Stella was particularly persistent. She had come over to check on Dotun, and after a while, the conversation naturally turned to Onome. Dotun, she began, her tone gentle but firm. I'm only saying this because I care about you. Onome is a lovely girl. She's hardworking, respectful, and kind. You should give her a chance. Maybe she's the person who can make you happy. Dotun, sitting across from her with his arms folded, shook his head. Auntie, I told you from the beginning, it's not going to work. I don't want a wife, and I don't want a relationship. Auntie Stella sighed dramatically, standing up as if to leave the room. But just as she started walking, she suddenly pretended to trip and fall, landing awkwardly on the floor with a loud thud. Auntie! Dotun exclaimed, jumping to his feet and rushing to her side. Are you okay? Auntie Stella groaned, clutching her ankle as she lay on the floor. Oh, my ankle! I think I hurt it. Help me up, Dotun. Dotun helped her to her feet, his concern quickly turning into suspicion. As he supported her to sit on the sofa, he gave her a sideways glance. Auntie, if you're pretending to be hot just to guilt me into something, it's not going to work. Auntie Stella shook her head, wincing in pain. Whether real or imagined, Dotun couldn't tell. I'm not pretending, Dotun. I have really hurt myself. But if you want me to get better, you will listen to my plea. Please, Dotun, consider giving Onome a chance. Do it for me. Dotun frowned, clearly skeptical. He knew his aunt was crafty, but there was a small part of him that wondered if she was actually in pain. Reluctantly, he sighed. Fine, Auntie. I will consider it. Just rest for now. Auntie Stella smiled, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. Thank you, Dotun. You have made an old woman very happy. After helping his aunt settle down, Dotun left the room and sat alone in his bedroom. He had agreed to think about giving Onome a chance, but only to get Auntie Stella off his back. He had no intention of pursuing a relationship with Onome, but as he sat there, he started to think about something else entirely. Dotun had always been clear about one thing. He didn't want to get married, but there was something he did want: children. He loved kids and had always dreamed of being a father. But in his mind, marriage and children didn't have to go hand in hand. As he thought about Onome's kind nature and how patient she had been with him, an idea started forming in his mind. What if he could take advantage of Onome's goodness? He didn't need to marry her, but maybe she could help him have the children he wanted. After all, she seemed like the type of woman who would be a good mother. Maybe he could convince her to have children with him without the commitment of marriage. The more Dotun thought about it, the more the idea made sense. He didn't want a wife, but he did want children. And Onome seemed like someone who could be a good mother. It was a perfect plan in his mind. But before he could move forward with it, he decided to talk to Tayo about it. The next day, Dotun called Tayo over to his house. As usual, they sat in the living room, chatting over drinks. Dotun hesitated for a moment before finally bringing up his plan. Tayo, he began cautiously. I have been thinking about something. Tayo raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Okay, what is it? Dotun leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. You know, I have always said I don't want to get married, right? Tayo nodded. Yeah, you have made that pretty clear. Well, I still don't want to get married, Dotun continued. But I have been thinking, I do want children, and I think Onome could help me with that. Tayo's expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Wait, what? What do you mean? Dotun shrugged. I mean, she's kind, responsible, and I think she would make a good mother. I could talk to her about having kids with me, but without the marriage part. It's perfect. Tayo stared at him, his mouth slightly open in shock. Dotun, have you lost your mind? You want to use Onome to have children without any commitment? That's not right, man. Dotun frowned. What's wrong with it? It's a mutual agreement. I don't want to hurt her. I just want kids. And she seems like someone who would be good with them. Tayo shook his head firmly. Dotun, listen to yourself. You're talking about using someone's kindness for your own benefit. Onome doesn't deserve that. If you don't like her, let her be. Don't drag her into some scheme because you want kids without the responsibility of marriage. Dotun sat back, his mind racing. He hadn't expected Tayo to react so strongly. I'm not trying to hurt her, he muttered. I'm just thinking about what's best for me. Tayo sighed, his tone more serious than ever. Dotun, you have always been my best friend, but I'm telling you now, this is a bad idea. You don't have feelings for Onome, then let her go. Don't take advantage of her, it's not right. Dotun was silent, unsure of what to say. For the first time, he began to question his plan. Maybe Tayo was right. Maybe this wasn't the way to go about things. But still, the thought of having children tugged at his heart, and he didn't know how to let go of that dream. As the evening wore on, Dotun couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads. One path leading to selfishness, and the other to doing what was right. But which one would he choose? One day, Dotun was sitting in the living room, lazily flipping through channels on the TV. The house was quiet as usual, with just the hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. He wasn't particularly focused on what was on the screen. His mind was elsewhere. He had been thinking a lot lately about his life, his choices, and most of all about Onome. Just as he was lost in thought, the front door creaked open, and in walked Onome, returning from a long day at work. She seemed tired, her shoulders slightly slumped, but as she stepped inside and noticed Dotun, her expression changed to one of caution. She had gotten used to his cold greetings, or worse, being completely ignored. But today, something was different. Good evening, she said, her voice soft, expecting the usual indifference. Dotun, to her complete surprise, looked up from the TV and smiled. Not a fake smile, but a real one. Good evening, Onome, he said warmly. How was your day? Onome blinked, staring at him in disbelief. Was this really Dotun? The same man who had spent the last few months barely acknowledging her existence? She couldn't help but ask, are you okay? Or are you dying or something? Dotun chuckled, shaking his head. No, I'm fine. Just trying to be a little nicer, I guess. Onome didn't know what to say. She stood there for a moment, still processing the unexpected warmth from Dotun. Oh, okay, she finally managed to say. Thanks. Oh, by the way, Dotun added, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. There is food in the kitchen if you are hungry. Onome's eyes widened in shock. Food? You made food? Dotun shrugged casually. Yeah, figured I would make something. Help yourself. Still reeling from the surprise, Onome nodded slowly. Thank you, she said quietly before heading to her room. Once inside her room, she sat on her bed, trying to wrap her mind around what had just happened. Dotun had smiled at her. He had asked about her day and even told her there was food waiting in the kitchen. Was this really the same man who had yelled at her just a few weeks ago for touching a bottle of water? Maybe he's sick, she muttered to herself, though she knew that wasn't the case. Something had changed in Dotun, but she didn't know what. Could it be that he was finally softening, or was it just an act? Despite her confusion, she was glad that the atmosphere in the house was changing. It was as though a heavy weight had been lifted, and for the first time in months, Onome felt like she could breathe easier. The next few days were different. Every time Onome and Dotun crossed paths, he greeted her with a smile. Sometimes they even exchanged a few words. It was nothing deep or personal, but it was far more than they had shared in the past. Onome found herself spending more time in the living room, something she had avoided before. She no longer felt the need to hide in her room all evening. One evening, as Onome sat in the living room reading a book, Dotun walked in carrying a tray of food. He set it down on the table and looked over at her. You want some? Onome looked up, startled by the offer. You made this? Yeah, Dotun said, nodding. I have been trying out some new recipes. Figured I would share. Okay, she said hesitantly, placing her book down and joining him at the table. She took a bite, and to her surprise, the food was delicious. This is really good. Dotun smiled, clearly pleased. Thanks, I'm glad you like it. As they ate, they made small talk about random things, nothing too personal, but it was a step towards normalcy. Onome couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. For the first time, Dotun seemed approachable. She even found herself smiling and laughing at his dry humor. It wasn't long before Onome felt comfortable enough to share her observations with Auntie Stella. One weekend, Auntie Stella came by for a visit, and as they sat together in the living room, Onome decided to tell her about the recent changes in Dotun's behavior. Auntie, Onome began, Dotun has been acting different lately. Auntie Stella's face lit up with interest. Different? How? Well, Onome continued. He's been nicer. He smiles more, talks to me, he even cooks sometimes and offers me food. It's like he's not the same person I met a few months ago. Auntie Stella beamed, clearly excited by the news. That's wonderful. I knew he would come around eventually. Dotun just needed time. Onome, however, wasn't as convinced. I don't know, Auntie. It's nice that he's been kinder, but I'm not sure I can trust him. He's always been so cold and mean before. What if this is just an act? Auntie Stella waved her hand dismissively. Nonsense. People change, Onome. Maybe Dotun has finally realized that he needs someone in his life, and that someone could be you. Onome frowned, shaking her head. I don't think so, Auntie. Dotun is. He's complicated. He's been hurt, and I don't think he's ready to let anyone in. Least of all me. Auntie Stella leaned in closer, her voice soft and encouraging. Onome, I have known Dotun all his life. He may seem tough, but deep down, he's a good man. You just have to be patient with him. Give him a chance, and maybe you will see a different side of him. Onome sighed, unsure of what to say. Auntie Stella seemed so hopeful, but Onome wasn't ready to open her heart. She had seen Dotun at his worst, and she didn't believe he had truly changed, even though he was being nicer now. She couldn't forget the months of hostility and coldness. I don't know, Auntie, Onome said quietly. I don't think I'm interested in loving Dotun. He's not the kind of person I want to be with. I just want to save enough money and leave this house without causing any problems. Auntie Stella looked disappointed, but she didn't press the issue. Well, just promise me you will think about it, okay? Sometimes love comes from the most unexpected places. Onome nodded, though she knew in her heart that love was the last thing on her mind. She had no intention of falling for Dotun. As far as she was concerned, her time in this house was temporary, and once she had enough money saved, she would move out and start fresh elsewhere. In the meantime, however, the atmosphere in the house continued to improve. Dotun didn't pry into her personal life, and Onome appreciated that. He didn't ask her questions about her family, her past, or her plans for the future. Instead, they kept their conversation light and casual, talking about work, food, or whatever was on TV. One evening, as they sat together watching a movie, Dotun glanced over at Onome and smiled. I never thought I would enjoy having someone around, he said quietly. Onome looked at him, surprised by his admission. What do you mean? I mean, Dotun continued, I have always been a loner. I never liked the idea of sharing my space with anyone. But you have made it easier. Onome didn't know how to respond to that part. Part of her wanted to smile and thank him, but another part of her was cautious, wondering if this was just another layer of Dotun's complex personality. Instead, she simply nodded and said, I'm glad to hear that. As the movie played on, Onome's thoughts drifted. Maybe Dotun had changed, or maybe he was just trying to make things more comfortable while she was still living with him. Whatever the reason, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer afraid of him. The man who had once yelled at her for simply existing had now become someone she could sit with, laugh with, and even enjoy a meal with. But despite the changes, Onome still kept her guard up. She had no interest in pursuing anything romantic with Dotun, and she had no plans to stay in his house any longer. Her heart remained focused on her future, her independence, and the hope of starting fresh somewhere else. For now, though, she would enjoy the peace in the house, grateful that the storm between them had finally passed, even if it was only temporary. One quiet afternoon, as Onome sat at her desk at work, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it, thinking it was probably one of her usual messages from friends or colleagues. But when she saw the sender and read the message, her heart sank. It was from her younger sister. The message was short, but it carried heavy news. Onome, Mama is very sick. The doctor said she needs urgent surgery. The bill is over 5 million naira. Please come home. Onome's hands began to tremble as she read the message over and over again, hoping she had misunderstood. Her mother, the one person who had sacrificed everything for her and her sister, was now in need, and Onome felt powerless to help. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought of her mother lying in a hospital bed, sick and helpless. Her mind raced. Where would she find 5 million naira? She barely had enough savings to get by, and her job didn't pay enough to cover such an expense. Onome had always been careful with money, saving what little she could, but she had never anticipated a situation like this. She needed help, and she needed it fast. After work, she returned to Dotun's house, her heart heavy with worry. She had been living in his house for months now, and although their relationship had improved somewhat, she was hesitant to ask him for help. But there was no other option. She had no one else to turn to. Dotun was in the living room watching TV when Onome came home. She stood there for a moment, unsure of how to start the conversation. She took a deep breath and walked over to where he was sitting. Dotun, she said softly. He glanced up, noticing the worry on her face. What's wrong, Onome? He asked, his tone surprisingly gentle. Onome swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. I need your help. Dotun sat up, turning off the TV. What kind of help? My mom, Onome began, her voice trembling slightly. She's very sick. The doctor said she needs surgery and it's going to cost over 5 million naira. I don't have that kind of money. I don't know what to do. Dotun leaned back, his expression thoughtful. That's a lot of money. I know, Onome said, her eyes filling with tears. I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice. You're the only person I can turn to. Dotun was silent for a moment, watching her carefully. Then he smiled, but it wasn't the warm, kind smile she had seen from him recently. This smile was different. It was calculating, almost cunning. I understand, Dotun said finally. Let me think about it. Onome nodded, grateful for even the slightest chance that he might help. Thank you, she whispered before heading to her room. That night, Onome couldn't sleep. Her mind was consumed with worry about her mother. Every minute felt like an eternity, and she kept checking her phone for updates from her sister. She prayed silently, asking God to make a way where there seemed to be none. Hours passed, and finally, just when Onome was about to give up on sleep entirely, there was a knock on her door. It was Dotun. Onome, he called out from the other side, his voice calm but serious. Can you come to the living room? I want to talk to you. Onome's heart raced as she quickly stood up and opened the door. She followed Dotun into the living room, where they both sat down. Dotun's face was serious now, his eyes focused on her. I have thought about your situation, he began, and I have decided that I can help. Onome's heart leaped with hope. Thank you so much, Dotun. I don't know how to repay you. Dotun raised a hand to stop her. Wait, Onome. There is a condition. Onome froze. A condition? Dotun leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Yes. I will give you the money for your mother's surgery, but only if you agree to do something. Onome felt a knot form in her stomach. What? What do you want me to do? Dotun's smile returned, but this time it was cold. I want you to give me a child. Onome blinked. Sure she hadn't had him right. What? I want you to have my child, Dotun repeated, his voice calm and measured. But there is a catch. We won't get married, and once the child is born, you won't be part of its life. I will raise the child on my own. Onome stared at him in shock, her mind reeling. You want me to have your baby, but not to be in its life. Dotun nodded, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. Exactly. You will get the 5 million now for your mother's surgery, and after the baby is born, I will give you another 5 million. It's a fair deal, don't you think? Onome felt sick. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Dotun, who had seemed like he was changing, who had shown kindness in recent weeks, was now revealing a side of himself she hadn't expected. This wasn't kindness. This was manipulation. I can't do that, Onome said, her voice barely a whisper. I can't give up my child like that. Dotun's expression hardened. Then I can't help you. Please, Dotun, Onome begged, tears streaming down her face. My mom needs that surgery. She is all I have left. Dotun leaned back in his chair, his voice cold and uncaring. I have made my offer, Onome. You can think about it. If you agree, I'll transfer the money immediately. If not, well, that's your decision. Onome's heart shattered. She stood up, feeling dizzy with disbelief. You are serious? Dotun nodded. Very serious. Think about it, Onome. You will get 10 million in total. That's enough to solve all your problems. Onome turned and fled to her room, slamming the door behind her. She collapsed on her bed, sobbing uncontrollably. How could he do this to her? How could he use her mother's life as leverage for something so cruel? She had thought Dotun had changed, that maybe he had started to see her as a human being, but now she realized he had been planning this all along. As she lay there, crying, Onome prayed desperately for guidance. God, please, help me. I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose my mom, but I can't do what he's asking. Please, show me the right path. The room felt cold and empty, and Onome was left with a sinking feeling of betrayal and despair. She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know how to save her mother. All she could do was hope that somehow a miracle would happen, because agreeing to Dotun's deal was something she could never do. The next morning, Onome woke up feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She hadn't slept much, her thoughts consumed by the impossible choice she faced. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, she made up her mind. There was no time to waste. She needed to get to the hospital and see what could be done for her mother. She quickly got dressed and hurried out of the house without saying a word to Dotun. The ride to the hospital seemed to take forever, even though it wasn't far. Her heart raced as she imagined her mother lying helpless, her life hanging in the balance. When she arrived at the hospital, she rushed to the front desk. The nurse directed her to the doctor in charge of her mother's case. Onome found the doctor in his office, his expression serious. Doctor, please, is there any updates on my mom's condition? Onome asked, her voice trembling. The doctor sighed and gestured for her to sit down. Your mother's condition is very critical, Onome. She needs the surgery as soon as possible. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. Onome bit her lip, feeling the sting of tears in her eyes. I don't have all the money yet. I have 500,000 naira, but I'll run around and get the rest. Please, just do something. Start the surgery. I'll find a way to pay the rest. The doctor shook his head gently. We can't start the surgery without at least half the payment upfront. It's hospital policy, and it's for the safety of the patient as well. If complications arise, we need to ensure all the resources are available. I'm sorry, Onome, but we need at least 2.5 million naira before we can proceed. Onome's heart sank even further. She had hoped they would make an exception, but now the harsh reality was clear. She was still far from the amount they needed, and time was running out. She thanked the doctor and made her way to the hospital room where her mother lay unconscious. The room was filled with the steady beeping of medical machines, and her mother's face looked pale against the white hospital sheets. Onome's younger sister sat at the edge of the bed, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Onome knelt beside her sister, wrapping her arms around her in a tight hug. I'm going to fix this, Onome whispered, though she wasn't sure how. I will get the money. And I won't let Mama die. I promise. Her sister sobbed quietly into Onome's shoulder. What are we going to do, Onome? We don't have that kind of money. I'll figure it out, Onome said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. But deep down, she knew what she had to do. There was no other way. As she left the hospital that evening, Onome made the decision that would change everything. She had no other choice. She would have to accept Dotun's offer. Her mother's life depended on it. When she got back to Dotun's house, she was met with the sound of laughter coming from the living room. Dotun was there with Tayo, the two of them chatting and joking as if nothing in the world was wrong. It felt strange to Onome, knowing the gravity of the decision she was about to make while they sat there laughing. She greeted them both with a quiet good evening, and then looked directly at Dotun. Can I speak to you for a moment? Tayo, sensing the seriousness in her tone, stood up. I will leave you two to it, he said, giving Dotun a knowing glance before heading out. Once Tayo was gone, Onome and Dotun sat down in the living room. Dotun looked at her expectantly, his face calm but curious. What is it, Onome? Onome took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. I have decided. I will do it. Dotun's eyes widened slightly, and then he smiled. That same calculating smile he had given her when he made the offer. You will do it? He asked, sounding surprised and pleased at the same time. Yes, Onome replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't have a choice. Dotun stood up, grinning from ear to ear. Well, that's good news. I'll call my lawyer in the morning and have the documents prepared. We'll need everything in writing. Onome frowned. Documents? Why do we need to sign anything? For legal purposes, of course, Dotun said, still smiling. We need to make sure everything is clear. You will give me the child, and in return, I will give you the money. It's all business. Onome felt a chill run down her spine. The way he spoke about it so casually, as if it were just another transaction, made her feel sick, but she nodded. Okay, I will sign whatever you need. The next day, as promised, Dotun's lawyer arrived at the house with a stack of papers. Onome sat at the dining table, her hands shaking as she held the pen. The lawyer explained each part of the agreement, detailing how she would have no claim to the child once it was born and how Dotun would take full custody. Onome felt numb and she signed her name on each page. Once everything was finalized, Dotun transferred the 5 million naira to her account. There you go, he said with a smile. You have got your money. Onome didn't even respond. She just stood up, grabbed her things and rushed out the door, heading straight to the hospital. When she arrived, she immediately paid the hospital bill and handed the receipt to the doctor. Here is the money. Please, save my mom. The doctor nodded and wasted no time in getting the surgery team ready. Onome waited outside the operating room, her heart pounding in her chest. She prayed harder than she had ever done, asking God to bring her mother through this surgery safely. Hours passed and finally, the doctor came out. He smiled gently, his eyes kind. The surgery went well, Onome. Your mother is stable now, but she will need time to recover. You can see her soon. Tears of relief filled Onome's eyes as she thanked the doctor. When she was finally allowed into the room, she sat by her mother's side, holding her hand as she slept. Her sister sat nearby, equally relieved. For the next few days, Onome stayed by her mother's side, barely leaving the hospital. She couldn't face Dotun, not yet. The weight of what she had agreed to weighed heavily on her, and every time she thought about it, she felt sick to her stomach. How could she have agreed to something so horrible? But then, she remembered her mother lying in that hospital bed, and she knew she had made the only choice she could. When her mother finally woke up, she looked around the room, her face weak but full of love when she saw her daughters. Onome, she whispered, her voice raspy. How did you manage to get the money? Onome hesitated, not wanting to burden her mother with the truth. Dotun lent me the money. She lied. I'll work hard to pay him back. Her mother smiled, her eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, my daughter. You have done so much for me. I'm so proud of him. Onome forced a smile, though inside she felt she was crumbling. She had saved her mother, but at what cost? Auntie Stella was there too, offering whatever help she could. She sat by her old friend's side, chatting with her and keeping her spirits up. Onome was grateful for Auntie Stella's presence, but every time she looked at her, she was reminded of Dotun and the deal they had made. After her mother was discharged from the hospital, Onome returned to work. She asked her younger sister to take care of their mother while she was away, and though she felt guilty for not being by her mother's side, she knew she had to keep moving forward. But now, every day felt heavier, as if the walls were closing around her. She had agreed to Dotun's terms, and soon she would have to face the reality of what that meant. The clock was ticking, and Onome didn't know how much longer she could bear the weight of the decision she had made. 2 days after Onome returned from the hospital, Dotun called her into the living room. His expression was serious, but his words were surprisingly calm. "It's time to proceed with what we agreed," Dotun said. Onome, though anxious, nodded. She knew this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. "How are we going to?" she began, unsure how to ask the question on her mind. Dotun cut her off, his tone matter of fact. "We won't be having any intimacy," he said. "We'll go to the hospital, and the doctors will handle it. There is no need for us to do it physically." Onome blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected this. For all the tension between them, she had assumed Dotun would expect more from her. But this revelation left her speechless. "You mean we won't?" Dotun nodded. "No, we won't. This is business." Onome exhaled, relieved but still conflicted. Dotun was a difficult person to understand, and this strange arrangement only made her wonder more about the kind of man he was. But she had no choice. She agreed, and they went to the hospital for the procedure. Within a short time, the doctors confirmed that Onome was pregnant. The news was both a relief and a burden. She was carrying Dotun's child, soon to be children, as they later found out. But it didn't bring her any joy. The agreement weighed heavily on her heart. She knew that once the babies were born, they wouldn't be hers. She would have to leave them behind. Dotun, however, seemed pleased. His attitude changed almost immediately after the pregnancy was confirmed. He forbade Onome from doing anything around the house, hiring a help to clean, cook, and take care of the chores. He wouldn't let her leave the house or lift a finger. He brought her gifts, bought baby clothes, and even decorated a nursery for the babies. Yet, with all the care he showed, Onome couldn't help but feel empty. She cried often, knowing that despite all this, she would lose her children to him. For Dotun, this was merely part of the agreement. He cared for Onome because of the babies, not out of love. He couldn't wait for the day when the deal would be over and he could finally have the children without her in his life. When Mr. Ajayi and Auntie Stella found out about the pregnancy, they were overjoyed. Believing that Onome and Dotun were in love, they showered them with blessings and congratulations. "You see, Dotun," Mr. Ajayi said during one of his visits, "I told you that Onome was a good girl. You have made the right choice, my son." Auntie Stella was equally thrilled. "This is the best news. I know you two would make a wonderful couple." Dotun and Onome played along, pretending to be happy. Dotun lied, telling them that he planned to marry Onome after the babies were born. Onome, not wanting to cause any problems, nodded in agreement whenever they talked about their supposed future together. 9 months passed and Onome went into labor. The delivery was far from what Dotun had expected. Instead of one child, as Dotun had anticipated, Onome gave birth to three, two boys and a girl. Dotun couldn't believe his eyes. "Triplets." "Three?" he muttered, looking at the babies in shock. Auntie Stella, who was there for the delivery, was ecstatic. "Triplets. Oh, what a blessing." Onome, on the other hand, didn't know how to feel. While she was happy that the babies were healthy, she was also terrified. She knew that once they turned 3 months, Dotun would take them from her, just as they had agreed. The thought of losing all three of them was unbearable. Her mother arrived shortly after, helping to care for the babies alongside Auntie Stella. For the first 3 months, Onome had plenty of support, and she was grateful for her mother and Auntie Stella's presence. They made sure she had everything she needed and helped her adjust to the demands of motherhood. But after 3 months, as agreed, both women left. Onome was now alone with Dotun and the babies. The house felt empty, and the weight of what was to come loomed over her. She had packed her bags, ready to leave, as per their agreement. She knew it was time to hand over the children to Dotun and walk away. One morning, as the baby slept, Onome approached Dotun. "It's time for me to go," she said quietly. "Our agreement is over." Dotun looked up at her, surprised. He hadn't expected her to actually leave. He glanced at the three sleeping babies, then back at Onome. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. "Don't go," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Stay at least until they are 1 year old." Onome's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" she asked, unsure of what to make of this request. Dotun nodded. "Yes, I mean it. Stay with them, with us. I'll take care of everything." Onome was stunned. This wasn't what she had expected from him at all. She smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. "Okay," she agreed. "I will stay." From that moment on, Dotun changed even more. He became fully involved in the care of the children, buying them gifts, helping Onome with the feedings, and ensuring that she never lacked anything. He was attentive, present, and dare she say it, kind. Onome couldn't believe the transformation she was seeing. It was as if Dotun had finally let down the walls he had built around himself. The year passed and the children grew into happy, healthy toddlers. But as the first birthday approached, Onome began to feel the weight of their original agreement pressing on her heart. She couldn't understand why Dotun was still keeping her around. The plan had been for her to leave once the babies turned 3 months old, but now a year had passed and Dotun hadn't asked her to go. One day, as the children were napping, Onome finally confronted him. "Dotun," she began, sitting beside him on the couch. "What do you really want from me?" Dotun looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we had an agreement," Onome said. "But you're not working with the agreement anymore. I was supposed to leave. But you have asked me to stay. Why?" Dotun hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. He had been asking himself the same question for a while. Why didn't he want her to leave? Why had he grown so attached to her presence in the house? Finally, he spoke. "I don't know," he admitted. I I don't want you to go. I don't know why, but I don't want to lose you." Onome was silent, trying to process what he was saying. "Dotun, do you, do you have feelings for me?" Dotun looked away, his expression pained. "I didn't expect to, but yes, I do. I know I haven't been the best person to you, Onome, but I want to make things right. I want you to give me a chance. Let me do right by you." Onome's heart raced. She hadn't expected this confession, but deep down, she had seen the change in him over the past year. Dotun was no longer the cold, distant man she had once feared. He had softened, and she found herself warming to him in ways she hadn't thought possible. As time passed, their relationship grew stronger. They talked more often, sharing their thoughts, dreams, and fears. One evening, as they sat together while the baby slept, Dotun leaned in and kissed her. It was gentle, slow, and filled with the emotions he had kept hidden for so long. The next day, Dotun professed his love for her, and to his surprise, Onome confessed that she felt the same way. They rebuilt their relationship from the ground up, and soon they made the decision to get married. Their wedding was a joyful celebration. All their friends and family were present. Mr. Jai, Auntie Stella, Tayo, Annabel, and even Onome's mother and her sister. Tayo couldn't stop teasing Dotun throughout the event, reminding him of how he had once sworn he would never get married. "I told you, man," Tayo laughed, clapping Dotun on the back. "Fate has a funny way of working, doesn't it?" Dotun smiled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I guess you are right." Annabel and Onome became close friends, bonding over their shared experiences of navigating life with Dotun and Tayo. The two families grew even closer, and the future seemed brighter than ever. Dotun had finally let go of the pain from his past. He no longer carried the bitterness and resentment he once felt towards women. Instead, he had embraced love, real, genuine love, and it had brought him more happiness than he ever thought possible. Onome too had found peace. What had started as an impossible situation had turned into a beautiful life. She was no longer afraid of losing her children, no longer bound by the weight of an agreement she had once regretted. She had found a partner, a father for her children, and a love that would last a lifetime. Together, Dotun and Onome lived happily ever after, with their three beautiful children and a future full of love and hope. This story teaches us that sometimes people can change when we least expect it. Dotun was once very angry and didn't trust anyone, but he learned that love can heal past hurts. Onome showed kindness even when things were tough, and in the end, she found happiness because she stayed patient and believed in a better future. This story also reminds us that life doesn't always go as planned, but love, kindness, and patience can bring good things into our lives. Thank you for watching this amazing story about Dotun and Onome on African Stories. If you liked it and felt inspired with their journey, please show your support by clicking the like button, sharing with your friends, and leaving a comment below. To see more interesting stories and learn about different cultures, subscribe to African Stories by V, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more stories to you. Until we meet again, stay connected, stay inspired, and keep smiling.